We start with Colonel Christopher Smith, who's Director of General Land Warfare, to talk about cyber warfare impact on Army modernisation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, mate. So tomorrow, for those who are aware, we're in here at 2 o'clock to discuss, I think, for about 3 hours, the Army's modernisation initiatives, concepts, where we're taking the Army and so on. So I don't intend to do that this afternoon. So I'm going to wade into the debate about hybrid warfare, what it is, and it's what it means for Army modernisation. And I stand firmly in the Mike Evans camp, as you probably worked out from the question I asked. But it was interesting. So sitting through this morning caused me, to question some of what I was thinking, which is the intention of a symposium like this one. But I found it difficult, and I don't know if you thought the same thing, that, to some extent there was this sense of difference and novelty and new, but there was also this sense of, and many of the presenters made the point that, hey, this hasn't changed. We reflected back to 1973 and other occasions, and sort of labouring to work out, okay, well, what do you take from this? Is the point that the presenters are trying to make is that the more things change, the more they stay the same, or am I supposed to draw some nugget out of it? And I must admit that my mind, despite what I'll do here for the sake of interest, is still open on this subject. But at the moment, I probably stand more in the scheme of the more things change, the more they stay the same. But the point that I'll make through this, and I'll begin with it and end with it, is that potentially it's not about things, it's not about particular circumstances, but potentially it's about a mindset. And I wonder if the lesson out of this, and I particularly drew this out, sir, from your, some of your comments, particularly around the AWA exercise and how it unfolded, that in fact it might be mindset. And I particularly drew on the example you gave of using a obsolete, light-skinned armoured vehicle, but swims, as many vehicles don't these days, and then able to use that in a circumstance and to gain advantage and leverage from it. That is that's an example of mindset. So when I asked, so I'll go into it. So when asked what the United States Army will be like in 20 years' time, General H.R. McMaster, who I'm assuming most of you will be aware of, he answered it will be about 80% like it is now. Now that might seem a flippant response to a serious question, but it is actually quite astute. We not only reflect on the Australian Army of 20 years ago and compare it to the one now, and we'll probably find that they're about 80% alike. Now, I imagine that the cynics among you would immediately proclaim, yeah, exactly, that's the problem. We're so conservative and inadaptive that we're still 80% like we were 20 years ago. But I don't think McMaster was decrying, in his case, the United States Army's failure to modernise or adapt when he responded the way he did, or at least on this particular occasion. Slide. I think he was pointing out that the United States Army is likely to look largely as it does today in 20 years' time, because the pace of change in warfare is not as great as many of us might think it to be. Now that's a pretty bold statement given the discussion today in the audience. Military revolutions are very rare and have tended to be a function of social change rather than technological change. Like the evolution of species, warfare tends to be in a state of punctuated equilibrium, with long periods of relative stability and infrequent but disruptive periods of rapid change, such as the period following the French Revolution. Now the question is are we going through one of those stages of major change, or is this a progression of the current state of equilibrium? Now let's take material acquisition decisions as an indicator. And I look at these, say, from the period of over 100 years. They tend, of course, to govern the form of armies for decades. And look at the US Army of now, for example. Its major weapon systems, such as the M109 Paladin, the Apache, the Black Hawk, the Abrams tank, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, originate from the 1960s and 70s. We already know largely what the Australian Army will look like into the 2030s. And if we take this morning's example, much of the technology we were looking at that Dr. Carver was presenting was in fact 1970s and 80s technologies, but used in a particular way, getting to the point of mindset. Slide please. So The Australian Army, I think we know what will look like in the 2030s largely. Acquisition decisions that we're making now or have made in recent years, such as decisions to acquire new utility helicopters, new trucks, new armoured fighting vehicles, medium-range air defence missiles, land-based anti-shipping missiles, rockets, unarmed aerial systems will likely be the core of our army into the 2030s and perhaps beyond. And while these systems will take advantage of the cutting edge in technology, none of them are particularly novel. All of the systems have been around in some form or another for at least 3 or 4 decades, some for over a century. Take, for example, precision missiles. While they might be new for the Australian Army, they've been around warfare for decades. Slide. So what? Well, historian Stephen Biddle made a convincing case in his 2004 book, Military Power Explaining Victory and Defeat in Modern Battle, that there is a modern system of warfare and it has remained largely unchanged since the latter years of the First World War. He would argue, I suspect, that we shouldn't be dismayed about our gradual modernisation. It's not just inevitable, it is correct and prudent. The principal features of the modern system are a function of industrial scale firepower, which has only grown more powerful since the First World War. To avoid accurate and immense industrial firepower, dispersion, concealment and suppression are key. They've been so since the end of the First World War and remain so now. Some would argue that's been the case since even as far back as the American Civil War. Now, Dr. Carber's earlier presentation seems to support Biddle's idea. In an interview in January 2006, he observed, and these are his words, "One of the things I find interesting about the military history of the 20th century is that you can look at it as a series of technological innovations that induce militaries to completely change what they do because they think that it's the magic bullet that's going to solve all of their military problems. Then they discover the hard way in real experience that no, the new technology isn't quite as decisive as we supposed. They are gradually forced by the pressure of this very intensive natural selection environment, which is battle, back toward a set of principles for tactics and strategy that revolve around exploiting cover and concealment to reduce your exposure to fire and enable you to move where your opponent cannot." Now, Biddle was in essence observing that there is no silver bullet to make war easier or make victory assured in the modern system. And so I contend it is with the idea of hybrid warfare. There is nothing in the idea of hybrid warfare that is particularly new or novel or that offers anyone in particular any great advantage, except I would agree with the discussion before about the difference in ethics and morality of the two different sides. And I include here information operations, cyber warfare, electronic warfare, space-based warfare, economic warfare, the use of proxies, and anything else we might include under the umbrella of hybrid warfare. Things that you might call ungentlemanly or novel features of hybrid warfare. So let's take the Russia-Ukraine case as an example, given that we spent some time on it this morning. Now, defence analyst Michael Kaufman argues that the annexation of Crimea by Russia was a classic covert operation preceding and enabling a conventional invasion. The lead element was Russian naval infantry already stationed inside the Crimea with the Black Sea Fleet. Well, there was some informational element to the occupation and some proxy or auxiliary units involved. These factors were relatively inconsequential to the real invasion by Russian special forces and conventional troops. As Kaufman points out, when the naval infantry of the 810th Brigade took off their patches and seized road intersections and key infrastructure, they didn't all of a sudden become hybrid warriors. They were Russian naval infantry without patches. They weren't little green men, they were infantry. It is convenient, of course, to have troops already based inside the territory that you wish to annex, and that's important. While the world's attention was fixed on the Crimea, however, Russia, with the support of vested Ukrainian oligarchs, mobilised people under their influence to protest in the Donbass region, which we know precipitated some of the cases that we heard at length this morning. They also advanced the interests of aligned politicians and political groups, echoing to some extent United States behaviour in Texas around the revolution in 1836, and to some extent Nazi German behaviour ahead of the Munich Agreement and the occupation of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Now, when the Ukrainian government arrested the self-declared governors and mayors of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, or the self-declared People's Republics, Russia supported local paramilitaries, mercenaries and ethnic Russian defectors from the Ukrainian armed forces to take up arms against the government. Now this was the guerrilla or irregular phase. Now this support was a function of intelligence operatives in collusion with local interests in a very traditional manner. Somewhat akin, I think, to the work of SOE in Europe through the occupation of Nazi Germany, rather than some particularly new or novel technique. And in May 2014, when Russia seemingly grew impatient with the apparent indecisiveness of that irregular warfare, in the face of stiff Ukrainian resistance, the Russians added conventional means into the mix, including the intermixing of Russian troops into separatist units, perhaps akin to Western practice in many conflicts over the last 50 years. Moscow soon abandoned this approach in favour of something more conventional when regular Russian units invaded the Ukraine that August, and we looked at many of those examples this morning. Slide. Ultimately, the Russian forces defeated the Ukrainian forces in the field, attaining quite limited objectives by conventional means, but attaining their objectives nonetheless. Kaufman points out that it was large calibre artillery, MLRS systems and tanks, not innovative hybrid approaches, that mattered in the end. I think this view is supported by some of what we've heard this morning. Since then, the Russians have been converting paramilitary auxiliaries into rather conventional units in a very orthodox train and equip type mission. Slide. And take the war against ISIS. For all the focus on ISIS's mastery of social media for propaganda and recruiting, it would seem that recent failure on the battlefield at the hands of very conventional Iraqi infantry and armour has done more to curb recruiting and support for ISIS than anything else, including Western air power. Perhaps success on the battlefield and then failure on the battlefield were the real arbiters of the relative success of or otherwise of ISIS recruitment, rather than the new vector for the propaganda. And what I'm trying to do here is separate means from the idea of strategy and perhaps the mindset that you apply to this business of warfare. Much, of course, is made of cyber warfare, for example, in the same vein. Certainly it is a new means for waging warfare, and a potentially, and I think clearly, powerful one. Computing power and networking offers enormous utility in warfare and increases the destructive power of armies, air forces and navies. But it also creates new and serious vulnerabilities. Slide, please. But we ought to be clear, attacks through cyberspace on enemy command systems, on banks, on national economies, power grids, opening up dam floodgates and the like are simply age-old sabotage, just using a conventional means of attack. So it's a different vector. But really, whether you're dropping a, next slide. That makes sense. So whether you're dropping a bouncing bomb on a dam or whether you're opening some floodgates by cyber means, the effect ultimately is the same. But while sabotage, espionage, assassination, etc. are important and have undoubted utility in war, they have rarely, if ever, been decisive without orthodox armed forces imposing their will on the enemy. And it would seem that contemporary wars are bearing this out. Slide. As weak as ISIS now seem to be, some poor bastard still has to go in and seize the occupied cities from them. Remember what Stephen Biddle said, the military history of the 20th century is a series of technological innovations that induce militaries to completely change what they do because they think that it's the magic bullet that's going to solve all their military problems, and that they are gradually forced by the pressures of the very intensive natural selection environment of war back toward a set of principles for tactics and strategy befitting the modern system. These cases seem to suggest Biddle is right. Slide, please. So is our new emphasis on social media, the use of proxies, cyber warfare and the like examples of the pursuit of a potential silver bullet or silver bullets? I don't think so, but we must be wary that it may become so. I was reminded this morning of the adage that armies at peace talk of manoeuvre, armies at war talk of firepower, particularly in Carber's presentation. So I'm not sure hybrid warfare is a thing, to use that Letterman example, but its emergence might be telling us something. If the contemporary idea of hybrid warfare has anything to offer us, it is perhaps to remind us that war and warfare are not just the business of armies or armed forces, and that subterfuge, deception, guile, espionage, sabotage, assassination, economic strangulation, trade manipulation, public diplomacy and so on have been and will always be features of war and warfare. But even more critically, even with the use of, say, social media, cyber espionage, cyber sabotage, propaganda, deceit and the like, war is still a matter of violence first and foremost. Next slide, please. And so despite one's potential mastery of these ungentlemanly arts, the decisive factor in war is most likely to be old-fashioned combat, where numbers of troops, numbers of weapons, and their relative destructive power, along with human willpower, and critically, the logistic sinews to sustain our heavier and more advanced army will matter most. Even deft application of manoeuvre theory, which by the way also has certain features of a silver bullet, won't relieve us of the need to take on the enemy at some point. After all, you can't seize Mosul without seizing Mosul. Which brings me to my perhaps disappointingly conservative observation, and those who know me won't be surprised by that. Which is that the army is unlikely to make wholesale changes on the back of hybrid warfare per se. Consequently, you may find it disappointing that the Australian Army is not modernising specifically for hybrid warfare. It's just modernising for modern warfare, warfare without a title or slogan, warfare that is violent and brutal, warfare that involves greater dispersion, greater need for suppression, greater need for concealment and cover, warfare that requires, and this is the key point, imagination, cunning, deception, subterfuge, guile, the sorts of things that we've heard about this morning. In other words, Stephen Biddle's modern system extended. Now tomorrow my team and I will discuss the particulars of the Army's modernisation plans, which will include discussion of means such as cyber capabilities, advanced sensors, precision missiles, counter-UAS systems, active protective systems, loitering munitions, weapon and integrated battle management systems, you name it. The Army is actually exploring it. But these endeavours are in response to developments in warfare generally, not hybrid warfare particularly. And we're modernising to Australia's particular circumstances, not necessarily to fight the Russians on the steppe. But I think that these instruments should not distract us from perhaps something more significant. And I think this is what the idea of hybrid warfare offers us, which is the need for a mindset adjustment potentially. And I think that if I could agree with Peter here, that maybe its utility is to jolt us out of a sense, and I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, that warfare and war can be broken up into packets of responsibility or neat packets of types, conventional type, irregular type, some other type, and that potentially we'd become comfortable in thinking inside a particular comfortable box, and that maybe if it offers us anything is to jolt us out of that box and start to recognise that age-old ideas, mindset, that deceptive and cunning and mindset using imagination of the tools you've got is what it really offers us as a lesson. Thank you.